Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. My friend dared me to use a Ouija board. Now we're both fucked. Alright, so here's the deal. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or spirits or any of that supernatural crap. Never was. I mean, I've always been the rational one in the group, but what happened recently changed everything. It still haunts me, and I can't sleep without the lights on. I need to get this off my chest. It all started with my friend Jack. He's always been the adventurous type, constantly looking for thrills and ways to scare the crap out of people. So when he dared me to use a Ouija board, I initially laughed it off. "Come on, man, that's just a load of bull," I said. But Jack was insistent. He'd gotten his hands on this old, worn-out board from a creepy antique shop downtown. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in a horror movie. "Don't be a chicken," he taunted, shoving the board into my hands. I could see the excitement in his eyes. Jack lived for this kind of stuff. Me, not so much. But he kept pushing and pushing, and eventually I caved. I figured, what the hell? It's just a stupid game, right? We set up in his basement, which was already creepy as hell. His parents were out of town, and the house was dead silent. We lit a few candles because, according to Jack, that was the way to do it. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, and I could feel my heart rate picking up. But I kept telling myself it was all in my head. We started with the usual routine. Jack placed the planchette in the center of the board, and we both put our fingers on it. He began asking the standard questions like, "Is there anyone here with us?" and "What's your name?" For a while, nothing happened. I was about to call it quits and head home when the planchette started moving. At first, I thought Jack was messing with me, but he swore up and down that he wasn't. The planchette spelled out HELLO. We both looked at each other, eyes wide. My stomach twisted in knots. Jack asked, "Who are we talking to?" And the planchette started moving again. This time, it spelled out ANNA. We continued asking questions, and it seemed like we were talking to some girl who had died in the 1800s. She claimed she was murdered and couldn't move on. Jack was thrilled, but I was getting seriously freaked out. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. I wanted to stop, but Jack was having too much fun. Then things got weird. I mean, really weird. Jack asked Anna how she died, and the planchette shot across the board, spelling out KILLEDBYHIM. We asked who him was, and the response we got was DEMON. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath in front of me, and the candle flames turned a sickly green. I wanted to end it right there, but Jack wouldn't let up. He asked, "What does the demon want?" The planchette moved slowly, as if whatever was controlling it was struggling. It spelled out BOTHOFYOU. At this point, I was done. I ripped my fingers off the planchette and stood up, but Jack grabbed my arm. "We have to say goodbye," he insisted. Reluctantly, I placed my fingers back on the planchette and moved it to goodbye. But that wasn't the end of it. As soon as we said goodbye, we heard this ungodly scream. It was high-pitched, like a woman being tortured. It echoed through the basement, and we both jumped up, knocking over the candles. We bolted upstairs and slammed the basement door behind us. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw a figure standing in the corner of my room, watching me. It was dark and shadowy, with glowing red eyes. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The next day, Jack called me, sounding panicked. He said he'd had the same experience, seeing the same figure in his room. We agreed not to talk about it, and hoped it would just go away. But it didn't. In fact, it got worse. Over the next few days, things escalated. I started hearing whispers, unintelligible and eerie, whenever I was alone. Objects in my house would move on their own. I'd find my stuff scattered around, things knocked over, and even scratches on the walls. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, I'd have these vivid nightmares where I was being chased by this demonic entity, and I could never escape. One night, I woke up with a jolt to find deep, bloody scratches on my arms and chest. They were fresh, still oozing, and the pain was excruciating. I called Jack in a panic, only to find out he had the same marks on his body. It was as if whatever we had contacted was physically tormenting us. Jack and I met up, desperate to find a solution. We researched everything we could about Ouija boards, spirits, and demons. Most of the stuff we found was useless, but one article stood out. It talked about how some spirits, especially demonic ones, can attach themselves to people and wreak havoc on their lives. The only way to get rid of them was to perform a proper cleansing ritual or seek help from a professional medium or exorcist. We tried the cleansing rituals ourselves, but they seemed to make things worse. The activity in our homes became more violent. Jack's dog was found dead in his backyard, mutilated in a way that no animal could have done. I was starting to lose my mind. I could feel this dark presence with me constantly, feeding off my fear. We decided to find a medium. We were desperate and willing to try anything at this point. We found a woman named Marjorie, who had a reputation for dealing with dark spirits. She agreed to help us, but warned that it wouldn't be easy. We met at Jack's house, and she immediately sensed the dark energy around us. Marjorie performed a ritual, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, burning sage and other herbs. The atmosphere in the room was intense, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. As she continued, I felt a searing pain in my chest, like something was being ripped out of me. Jack screamed and collapsed, convulsing on the floor. Then, everything went silent. The candles blew out, and we were left in complete darkness. Marjorie's voice cut through the silence. "It's not over," she said. "The entity is strong and deeply attached to you both. This will take more than one session." Jack and I left her house that night, feeling more hopeless than ever. The nightmares persisted, and the presence was still there, lurking in the shadows. We were trapped in this nightmare with no way out. Part 2 to come if anyone's interested. But be warned, it only gets worse from here. So yeah, things only got worse after our first session with Marjorie. Jack and I were both losing sleep, and the dark circles under our eyes were a permanent fixture. It felt like we were living in a horror movie, but this wasn't some scripted scare. It was real, and it was relentless. The days blurred together. I'd hear whispers in my ear when no one was around. Sometimes it felt like icy fingers were brushing against my skin, sending chills down my spine. The shadows in my house seemed to move on their own, creeping closer whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see those glowing red eyes staring back at me. Jack was having a rough time too. He called me one night, his voice trembling. "Dude, I can't do this anymore. It's like it's always watching me. I see it in the mirror, in the corner of my eye. I think it's trying to take over." He sounded broken, a shell of his former self. The thrill seeker I once knew was gone, replaced by a terrified man teetering on the edge of sanity. Marjorie had warned us that the entity would fight back, but we had no idea just how vicious it could be. She agreed to another session, this time at my place. We hoped that a change of location might help, but deep down, I was terrified it would make things worse. When Marjorie arrived, she brought a small team with her, 2 other mediums, both older and just as serious as Marjorie. They set up a circle in my living room, placing crystals and burning incense. The air was thick with the smell of sage, and the tension was palpable. Jack and I sat in the middle of the circle, feeling like lab rats awaiting some twisted experiment. The ritual began, and immediately the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath, and the shadows seemed to thicken, closing in on us. Marjorie and her team chanted in unison, their voices blending into a haunting melody. The candles flickered violently, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like a weight pressing down on my soul. Suddenly, Jack screamed. His body lifted off the ground, suspended in mid-air. His eyes rolled back, and a guttural growl escaped his lips. The mediums intensified their chanting, but it seemed to have little effect. I watched in horror as dark, shadowy tendrils wrapped around Jack's limbs, pulling him in different directions. "Fight it, Jack!" Marjorie shouted, but Jack was beyond hearing. His body convulsed, and the room shook as if an earthquake was ripping through it. I wanted to help him, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadows around us grew darker, more solid, and I could feel their malevolence. Then, just as suddenly as it began, Jack's body dropped to the floor with a sickening thud. The room fell silent. The shadows receded, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. Jack lay motionless, his breathing shallow and ragged. Marjorie approached him cautiously, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the entity is still with him. We couldn't break its hold completely." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. If Marjorie and her team couldn't help us, who could? We were running out of options and time. The nightmares, the attacks, the constant feeling of being watched. It was all taking a toll. I could see it in Jack's vacant eyes, the same hopelessness I felt inside. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and terrifying encounters. The entity seemed to grow stronger, feeding off our fear and desperation. Jack was deteriorating rapidly. He barely ate or slept, and his skin was pale and clammy. I tried to stay strong for both of us, but I was crumbling under the pressure. One night I woke to the sound of whispering. It was different this time, clearer, almost as if the entity was right beside me. I turned on the light, and there it was, standing at the foot of my bed, a tall, shadowy figure with those damn red eyes. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or look away. The figure slowly reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, searing pain in my chest. It was like my very soul was being ripped apart. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was endure the agony. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me gasping for air and drenched in sweat. The next morning, I found more scratches on my body, deeper this time. They bled through my shirt, staining it a dark red. I knew then that this was far from over. The entity was toying with us, breaking us down piece by piece, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Jack and I decided to try one last thing. We reached out to a renowned exorcist, Father O'Malley. He had a reputation for dealing with the most severe cases of possession and hauntings. Desperation drove us to his doorstep, hoping against hope that he could save us. Father O'Malley agreed to help, but he warned us that it would be dangerous. The entity had a strong hold on us, and breaking that hold would come at a cost. We were willing to pay any price to be free from this nightmare. The exorcism was set for the next night. Father O'Malley arrived, carrying a heavy, ancient-looking book and a vial of holy water. His presence was calming, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed our lives. He set up in Jack's living room, the place where this all began, and began to pray. The air grew thick with tension as he recited passages from his book. The candles flickered, and the temperature dropped once more. Jack and I stood in the centre, holding hands, our knuckles white with fear. The entity made its presence known almost immediately, manifesting as a dark cloud that enveloped the room. Father O'Malley didn't falter. He continued his prayers, splashing holy water around us. The entity screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like my ears would bleed. Jack convulsed, and I held on to him tighter, refusing to let go. The exorcism lasted for what felt like hours. The entity fought back with all its might, but Father O'Malley was relentless. Finally, with a final deafening scream, the entity seemed to explode, the dark cloud dissipating into thin air. The room fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. Jack collapsed, conscious but alive. I could feel the difference immediately. The air was lighter, and the shadows were just shadows again. Father O'Malley looked exhausted, but triumphant. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with relief. "The entity is gone." We were free, but the scars remained. Jack and I would never be the same. We had faced a darkness that few could understand, and it had left its mark on us. But we had survived, and for now, that was enough. Part 3 coming soon, if you guys want to hear more about the aftermath and how we're coping. Just be warned, the scars run deep, and the darkness isn't so easily forgotten. It's been a few months since the exorcism, and while the entity is gone, the aftermath of what we went through still haunts us. Jack and I don't talk about it much, but the silence speaks volumes. We're both trying to move on, but some things are easier said than done. Jack moved out of his parents' house and into a small apartment on the other side of town. He thought a change of scenery might help, but I can tell he's still struggling. His once vibrant personality is now subdued. He's jumpy, always looking over his shoulder, and he started drinking more than usual. I worry about him, but I'm barely holding it together myself. The nightmares haven't completely stopped. They're less frequent, but when they come, they're just as vivid and terrifying as before. I still see that shadowy figure with the red eyes in my dreams, watching me, waiting. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I keep the lights on at night and sleep with a knife under my pillow, even though I know it's irrational. Old habits die hard, I guess. I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Peterson, trying to make sense of everything. She's kind and patient, but it's hard to put into words what Jack and I went through. The fear, the sense of helplessness, the constant feeling of being watched. It's something no one can truly understand unless they've lived it. Dr. Peterson says it's PTSD, that my mind is trying to process the trauma. Maybe she's right, but knowing that doesn't make the memories any less real. One night, Jack called me in a panic. It was around 2 a.m. and he sounded more scared than I'd ever heard him. "It's back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I saw it. The eyes, the shadow. It's here." My blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping against hope that he was mistaken. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. The terror in his voice was unmistakable. "I swear to God, man, it's here. I don't know what to do." His voice cracked, and I could hear the desperation. I told him to come over to my place, that we'd figure it out together. He showed up 20 minutes later, pale and shaking. We stayed up all night, talking and trying to make sense of it all. The next day, we reached out to Father O'Malley again. He was our last hope. We explained what happened, and he agreed to come over that evening. When he arrived, he looked concerned but determined. He performed another blessing, this time focusing on protection. He assured us that the entity wasn't back, but that residual energy might be causing us to see things. He gave us each a blessed pendant to wear, promising that it would keep us safe. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The nightmares became less intense, and the feeling of being watched faded. Jack and I started to reclaim a sense of normalcy. I went back to work, and Jack started seeing a therapist too. We were making progress, however slow it might have been. Then, about a month later, things took a turn for the worse. I was at home, trying to relax after a long day, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jack. "It's here. Help!" My heart dropped. I grabbed my car keys and drove to his apartment as fast as I could. When I got there, the place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and there were deep gouges in the walls, like something with claws had been there. Jack was huddled in a corner, clutching the pendant Father O'Malley had given him. "It came for me," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It was right here. It touched me." He pulled up his shirt, and I saw fresh scratches on his chest, identical to the ones we'd had before. We were back at square one. Whatever we'd done, it hadn't been enough. The entity, or whatever it was, had found a way back into our lives. I called Father O'Malley, but he didn't have any new answers. He suggested we seek out someone even more experienced, a specialist in dealing with malevolent spirits. That's how we found Dr. Evelyn Harper. She was an older woman with a reputation for dealing with the darkest of entities. She agreed to meet with us, and from the moment we stepped into her home, I could tell she was different. The air around her felt charged, and her eyes seemed to see right through you. Dr. Harper listened to our story without interruption, nodding thoughtfully. When we finished, she leaned back and sighed. "What you're dealing with is not just a spirit," she said. "It's something much older and far more dangerous. It's a parasite, feeding off your fear and suffering." She explained that this entity had latched onto us from the moment we used the Ouija board. It thrived on the chaos it created, growing stronger with each passing day. The exorcism had weakened it, but it hadn't been enough to sever the bond completely. We needed a more powerful ritual, one that required significant preparation and risk. Desperate, and with no other options, we agreed. Dr. Harper began to prepare, instructing us on what we needed to do. The ritual would take place over 3 days, involving a combination of protective symbols, chants, and potions. We had to follow her instructions to the letter, or we risked making things even worse. The first night of the ritual was intense. Dr. Harper drew intricate symbols on the floor of Jack's apartment, placing candles at specific points. She mixed a potion of herbs and oils, which we had to drink. The taste was vile, but we forced it down, knowing it was necessary. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavy. The shadows seemed to pulsate, and the air was thick with tension. Dr. Harper began to chant, her voice strong and unwavering. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, and the candles flickered wildly. Jack and I sat in the center, holding hands, trying to stay calm. The entity made its presence known almost immediately. The temperature dropped, and a dark mist filled the room. Whispers echoed around us, and I could feel a cold, malevolent presence closing in. "Stay strong," Dr. Harper commanded. "Do not break the circle." Her chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the symbols on the floor blazed with light. The entity screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The mist swirled violently, and the shadows writhed. Jack's grip tightened on my hand, his knuckles white. The pressure in the room was unbearable, like being crushed by an invisible force. I struggled to breathe, my vision blurring, but Dr. Harper didn't falter. She continued her chant, her voice a beacon of strength. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the mist began to recede. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the whispers faded. The symbols on the floor dimmed, and the candles steadied. Dr. Harper stopped chanting, her face etched with exhaustion. "It's done," she said, her voice hoarse. "The bond is broken." Jack and I collapsed, overwhelmed with relief. The air felt lighter and the oppressive presence was gone. We knew it wasn't over. The trauma and memories would stay with us. But for the first time in months, we felt a glimmer of hope. Part 4 coming soon. If you guys want to hear more about how we're dealing with the aftermath and the steps we're taking to heal. It's a long road, but we're finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Since the ritual with Dr. Harper, things have been quieter. I wish I could say everything is back to normal, but that would be a lie. Jack and I are still dealing with the scars, both physical and emotional, left by our encounter with the entity. We've started to rebuild our lives, but the road to recovery is long and fraught with reminders of our ordeal. Dr. Harper continues to check in on us, providing guidance and support. She suggested we keep a journal of our experiences to help process the trauma and track any lingering activity. Writing things down has been cathartic, but it also forces me to relive the horror night after night. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever truly feel safe again. Jack is having a harder time. He's withdrawn, barely leaving his apartment. He told me he sees things out of the corner of his eye, fleeting shadows, whispers in the dark. I can't tell if it's paranoia or if there's still something there, lurking. We agreed to meet once a week, to support each other and ensure we don't spiral into madness alone. One night, Jack didn't show up. I called him, but there was no answer. Panic set in, and I drove to his apartment, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I got there, his door was ajar. The place was a wreck, furniture overturned, scratches on the walls. It felt eerily familiar, a chilling reminder of the night we first encountered the entity. I found Jack in his bedroom, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He was pale, trembling, clutching the pendant Father O'Malley had given him. "It's back," he whispered, eyes wide with fear. "I saw it. It's trying to drag me back." I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. We had done everything right, the rituals, the blessings, but it seemed the entity wasn't done with us. I called Dr. Harper immediately. Explaining the situation, she arrived within the hour, her face grim. "This isn't residual energy," she said, examining the room. "It's something more. We need to perform another ritual, but this one will be different, more intense." We followed her lead, preparing the apartment for what felt like another battle. Dr. Harper drew new symbols, more complex and intricate, on the floor. She lit candles, their flames flickering ominously, casting long shadows on the walls. Jack and I sat in the center of the circle, the fear palpable between us. Dr. Harper began to chant, her voice steady and commanding. The air grew thick, oppressive, and I felt that familiar, malevolent presence closing in. The shadows seemed to dance, taking on shapes that made my skin crawl. Jack gripped my hand, his knuckles white. As the chanting continued, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath in the air, and the room seemed to close in around us. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, a dim light against the encroaching darkness. The entity made its presence known, a low growl reverberating through the apartment. Dr. Harper didn't waver. She continued her incantations, her voice rising in intensity. The growl turned into a scream, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. Jack convulsed beside me, his eyes rolling back. The shadows thickened, pressing in on us, suffocating. Then, with a final, deafening scream, the shadows exploded outward, dissipating into nothingness. The air cleared, and the oppressive weight lifted. The symbols on the floor dimmed, and the room returned to normal. Dr. Harper slumped, exhausted but triumphant. "It's over," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For now." Jack and I collapsed, overwhelmed with relief. The entity was gone, but the fear remained. We knew it could come back, that we'd never truly be free. But for now, we had each other, and that was enough. Part 5 coming soon, if you guys want to hear about how we're coping and the steps we're taking to ensure the entity doesn't return. It's a constant battle, but we're learning to live with the darkness. After the final ritual with Dr. Harper, things slowly started to improve. The oppressive presence was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack and I began to feel a semblance of normalcy returning to our lives. But the journey to recovery was far from over. Jack and I made a pact to support each other no matter what. We attended therapy sessions regularly, both individually and together. Dr. Peterson helped us process the trauma, though the memories were still raw and painful. We talked about the entity, the fear, and the lasting impact it had on our lives. The more we talked, the more we began to understand the depth of our scars. One night, while sitting in Jack's apartment, we decided to make a list of things we could do to reclaim our lives. It was a small step, but it felt empowering. We listed activities we enjoyed, places we wanted to visit, and people we missed connecting with. Slowly, we began to reintroduce these elements into our daily routines. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. It became a way for me to express the darkness inside me, to confront it and transform it into something tangible. Jack took up running, finding solace in the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement. It was his way of escaping the shadows that lingered in his mind. We also made a conscious effort to stay in touch with our friends and family. Isolation had been our enemy, and reconnecting with loved ones provided a sense of security and normalcy. We hosted game nights, went out for dinners, and tried to live our lives as if the entity had never existed. Despite our efforts, there were still moments of fear. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, or hear a whisper in the dead of night. But I learned to remind myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Jack struggled too, but together, we faced our fears head on. Dr. Harper continued to be a guiding presence in our lives. She checked in on us regularly, offering advice and support. She even introduced us to a support group for people who had experienced paranormal events. Sharing our story with others who understood was incredibly therapeutic. We weren't alone in our struggle, and that realization brought us a sense of comfort. One evening, about 6 months after the final ritual, Jack and I decided to visit the antique shop where this all began. It was a way for us to confront our past and close that chapter of our lives. The shop was as eerie as I remembered, filled with strange artifacts and the smell of old wood. We found the Ouija board, now locked in a glass case with a warning sign. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I felt a strange sense of closure. This piece of wood and plastic had brought so much chaos into our lives, but standing there, I realized it no longer had power over us. As we left the shop, Jack turned to me and smiled. "We made it through, man. We're stronger now." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side. The entity might have left its mark on us, but it didn't define us. Life isn't perfect, and we still have our bad days, but we're moving forward, one step at a time. The fear that once consumed us has faded to a dull ache, a reminder of what we survived. We've learned to live with the darkness, to find light in the smallest of things. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, know that you're not alone. The darkness can be overwhelming, but there is always a way out. Find your support system, hold on to the things that bring you joy, and never stop fighting. Because in the end, we all have the strength to face our demons and come out stronger. Thank you for following our story. This is the end, but also a new beginning. Stay safe and remember, the light always returns. I am a YouTuber that explores abandoned places. Last night I found my dad doing a ritual in an abandoned hospital close to our town. Hey everyone, long-time lurker, first-time poster. I never thought I'd have anything to share, but after last night I can't keep this to myself. I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here can help me make sense of it. Here's the thing. I'm a YouTuber who explores abandoned places. It's a niche, but it's mine. My channel isn't huge, but I've got a decent following. People seem to love the thrill of exploring places long forgotten. I've seen a lot of weird stuff, but nothing prepared me for what I found last night. It started like any other night. I decided to check out an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of our town. It had been closed for decades, rumoured to be haunted, and was always the subject of local legends. People claimed to hear screams, see shadows, and feel cold spots. You know, the usual spooky stuff. I'd been wanting to explore it for a while, but something always held me back. Last night, I decided it was time. I packed up my gear, double-checked my camera, and headed out around midnight. It was a cloudy night, no moonlight to guide me, just the dim beam of my flashlight. The hospital loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky. As I approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The front door was boarded up, but I found a broken window around the side and managed to squeeze through. Inside, it was even darker. The only sound was my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The place was a mess, broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, graffiti on the walls. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I made my way through the main lobby and down a long corridor, shining my flashlight into rooms as I passed. Most of them were empty, just more debris and decay. But then I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a chant. I stopped, straining to hear. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the hospital. My heart started pounding, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound. The whispers grew louder as I approached an old operating room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a flickering light coming from inside. I pushed the door open and froze. Inside, the room was lit by dozens of candles, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, there was a large, intricate symbol drawn on the floor in what looked like blood. And there, Standing in the middle of it was my dad. My dad is the last person I'd expect to see in a place like this. He's always been a straight-laced, no-nonsense kind of guy. Seeing him there, in the middle of a ritual, was like stepping into a nightmare. He was chanting something in a language I didn't understand, his eyes closed, completely oblivious to my presence. For a moment, I just stood there, too shocked to move. Then, my camera beeped, low battery. The sound seemed to snap my dad out of his trance. His eyes flew open, and he looked right at me. I expected him to be angry, to yell at me for being there, but instead, his face twisted into a look of pure fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "You need to leave, now." Before I could respond, he rushed towards me, grabbed my arm, and practically dragged me out of the room. As we hurried down the hall, I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, almost angry. My dad didn't stop until we were outside, the hospital looming behind us like a dark, malevolent presence. He let go of my arm and turned to face me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "You can never come back here. Do you understand? Never." I nodded, too stunned to argue. He gave me one last, desperate look before turning and walking away, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. My dad, performing a ritual in an abandoned hospital? It didn't make any sense. When I finally made it back home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the night's events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Who were the whispers? What was my dad doing there? And why was he so terrified? I don't have any answers, but I know one thing for sure. Something is very, very wrong. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning. I didn't get any sleep that night. My mind kept spinning with questions and fear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my dad's face, twisted in terror, and heard those whispers echoing in my ears. By morning, I was exhausted, but determined to get some answers. The first thing I did was try to talk to my dad. I waited until he got home from work, watching the clock with a knot in my stomach. When he finally walked through the door, he looked as tired as I felt. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't meet my eyes. "Not now," he muttered, heading towards his study. I followed him, my frustration growing. "No, Dad. We need to talk about last night. What were you doing in that hospital?" He froze, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me, but then he shook his head. "It's better if you don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let it go." "Let it go," I repeated, my anger boiling over. "You were in an abandoned hospital, doing some kind of ritual. You dragged me out of there like your life depended on it. And now you're telling me to let it go." He turned to face me and I could see the fear in his eyes again. "I'm trying to protect you," he said. "You saw things you weren't meant to see. Please, just trust me." "Trust you?" I said, my voice rising. "How can I trust you when you won't tell me what's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into his study and closed the door, leaving me standing in the hallway, feeling more confused and alone than ever. Over the next few days, things only got worse. My dad avoided me, barely speaking to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me, but whenever I turned around, there was no one there. The whispers haunted my dreams, and I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was coming. I decided to go back to the hospital, even though my dad had warned me not to. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them sitting at home. I packed up my gear again, making sure to bring extra batteries for my camera. This time, I also brought a small knife, just in case. I wasn't sure what I was going to face, but I wanted to be prepared. I waited until nightfall, then slipped out of the house and headed back to the hospital. The building looked even more ominous than before, the broken windows staring at me like empty eyes. I took a deep breath and climbed through the same window I had used last time. Inside, the hospital was just as dark and silent as before. I made my way back to the operating room, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The candles were still there, melted down to stubs, and the symbol on the floor looked even darker, almost like it was pulsing with some kind of energy. I pulled out my camera and started recording, documenting everything. "I don't know what I'm going to find," I whispered to the camera, "but I need to know what's going on." As I stepped closer to the symbol, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, even though there were no windows or doors open. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost frantic. I tried to make out the words, but they were in that same strange language my dad had been chanting. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move closer, closing in on me. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the doorway, watching me. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers and eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure stepped into the room, and I could see its face, pale and gaunt, with a twisted smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a harsh whisper that echoed in my mind. "This place is not for you." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and no sound came out. The figure took another step closer, and I could feel the cold radiating off it. "You've seen too much," it said. "Now you must pay the price." Before I could react, it lunged at me. I screamed, dropping my camera and fumbling for the knife. The figure's fingers wrapped around my throat, cold and strong, and I felt my vision start to fade. Just as I thought I was going to pass out, the figure suddenly let go. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When I looked up, the figure was gone, and the room was silent again. I grabbed my camera and ran, not stopping until I was outside, the hospital looming behind me like a dark shadow. I didn't look back. I just kept running, desperate to get away from whatever was in that hospital. When I finally got home, I collapsed on my bed, my mind racing. I had more questions than ever, but one thing was clear. Whatever my dad was involved in, it was dangerous. And now, I was caught in the middle of it. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My throat was sore, and my muscles ached from the encounter in the hospital. I checked my camera, hoping that I'd managed to capture something useful. As I reviewed the footage, my heart sank. Most of it was too dark and shaky to make out anything clearly, but there were a few frames where the figure was visible, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. I decided to upload the footage to my channel, hoping that maybe one of my followers could help me figure out what I was dealing with. I titled the video, "I Found Something Terrifying in an Abandoned Hospital," and uploaded it with a brief explanation of what had happened. Almost immediately, the comments started pouring in. Most people were just as confused and scared as I was, but a few mentioned something called the Watcher, a figure from local legends said to guard sacred places and punish those who trespass. I didn't have time to dwell on it though, because my dad came home early from work, his face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," he said, his voice shaking. I followed him into the kitchen, my heart pounding. He sat down at the table and motioned for me to sit across from him. "I know you went back to the hospital," he said, not looking at me. "I saw your video." I nodded, my mouth dry. "Dad, what's going on? What was that thing in the hospital? And why were you doing a ritual there?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I didn't want to involve you in this," he said, "but I guess it's too late now." He took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "Our family has been part of a secret order for generations. We're tasked with protecting certain places from things that should never be disturbed." "Things like the Watcher?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Yes. The Watcher is one of many entities that guard these places. They're ancient, powerful, and very dangerous. The ritual I was performing was meant to keep the Watcher dormant, to prevent it from causing harm. But something went wrong. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, something went wrong? He looked away, his face etched with guilt. I made a mistake, he said. I was distracted, and the ritual wasn't completed properly. That's why the Watcher is awake now, and why it attacked you. Why didn't you tell me about this? I asked, anger bubbling up inside me. I could have helped you. I was trying to protect you, he said, his voice breaking. This is dangerous, and I didn't want you to get hurt. Well, it's too late for that, I snapped. What do we do now? We need to complete the ritual, he said. Tonight, before the Watcher gains more power. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. And what if we fail? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. That night, we packed up our gear and headed back to the hospital. My dad had brought a bag filled with strange items. Candles, herbs, and a book with symbols that looked like something out of a horror movie. He handed me a small vial filled with a dark liquid. Drink this, he said. It will protect you. I hesitated, but then nodded and downed the contents. It tasted bitter and metallic, but almost immediately I felt a strange warmth spread through my body. We entered the hospital through the same window, the building even more foreboding than before. As we made our way to the operating room, the air grew colder, and the whispers started again, louder and more frantic. When we reached the room, my dad quickly set up the candles and began chanting in that strange language. The symbol on the floor started to glow, and I felt a surge of energy in the air. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around us. I tried to stay focused, holding the camera steady as my dad continued the ritual. But then, the Watcher appeared in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped even further. "Keep filming!" my dad shouted over the noise. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." The Watcher moved closer, its twisted smile sending chills down my spine. My dad's chanting grew louder, more desperate, and I could see sweat pouring down his face. Suddenly, the Watcher lunged at me, its fingers outstretched. I stumbled back, but the warmth from the vial seemed to create a barrier between us. The Watcher hissed, recoiling as if in pain. My dad seized the moment, raising his arms and shouting the final words of the ritual. The symbol on the floor flared with a brilliant light, and the Watcher let out an ear-piercing scream. It tried to flee, but the light engulfed it, pulling it towards the symbol. With a final agonized cry, the Watcher was sucked into the glowing symbol, which then faded away, leaving only a faint outline on the floor. The room fell silent, the air warm again. My dad collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. "It's done," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Watcher is sealed away." I helped him to his feet, my hands shaking. "What now?" I asked. "We need to leave," he said, "and never come back." As we made our way out of the hospital, I couldn't help but look back one last time. The building seemed almost peaceful now, but I knew better. There were still secrets hidden within its walls, secrets that I would never fully understand. And as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, I knew that this was only the beginning. Life didn't exactly return to normal after that night. My dad and I never spoke about the ritual again, but the tension between us was palpable. He avoided me more than ever, retreating into his study for hours at a time. I tried to focus on my YouTube channel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. A week after the ritual, I woke up to find a note slipped under my bedroom door. It was from my dad, scribbled hastily in his familiar handwriting. "Meet me at the park at noon. We need to talk." The park was a neutral place, away from the house and its oppressive atmosphere. I got there early, sitting on a bench and watching the kids play on the swings. When my dad finally arrived, he looked more haggard than I'd ever seen him. "We need to discuss what happened," he said, sitting down next to me. "There are things you need to know." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Okay, I'm listening." He took a deep breath. "The ritual we performed was only a temporary solution. The Watcher is sealed away for now, but it will return. And when it does, it will be even more powerful." I felt a chill run down my spine. What do we do? There's a way to permanently seal the Watcher, he said, but it's dangerous and it requires a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked away, his eyes filled with pain. A life. I stared at him, my mind racing. You mean someone has to die? He nodded. Yes. The ritual requires the blood of someone who carries the mark. The mark? I repeated, feeling a knot form in my stomach. What are you talking about? He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a small, intricate symbol on his forearm. This mark, it's a symbol of our family's connection to the Order. Only those with the mark can perform the ritual. I looked down at my own arm, my skin crawling. Do I have one? He nodded. Yes. It appeared the night you were born. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. So what now? Are we supposed to just wait for the Watcher to come back? There's a way to transfer the mark, he said, but it's risky, and if it fails, the consequences could be catastrophic. What do you mean, transfer the mark? I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. If the mark is transferred to someone else, they will carry the burden of sealing the Watcher, but the process is dangerous, and if it goes wrong, both the donor and the recipient could die. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. And you're willing to take that risk? He nodded. Yes, I've carried this burden for too long. It's time for someone else to take over. I felt a surge of anger. And what if I don't want to transfer the mark? What if I want to help you seal the Watcher for good? He looked at me, his expression unreadable. You don't know what you're asking. This isn't a game. This is life and death. I know that, I said, my voice trembling. But I can't just stand by and do nothing. If there's a way to stop the Watcher for good, I want to be a part of it. He sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, but you need to understand what you're getting into. This will be dangerous. And if we fail, I know, I said, cutting him off. But we have to try. That night, we began preparing for the final ritual. My dad laid out the necessary items, more candles, herbs, and the ancient book. He also brought out a dagger, its blade glinting ominously in the dim light. This is the ritual dagger, he explained. It's been passed down through our family for generations. It's the only thing that can properly seal the Watcher. I nodded, my hands shaking as I took the dagger. It felt heavy, the weight of its history pressing down on me. What do I need to do? He walked me through the steps, explaining each one in detail. We'll need to perform the ritual at the exact moment the Watcher returns. Timing is crucial. If we're even a second off, it could all go wrong. We headed back to the hospital, the familiar dread settling over me as we approached. The building seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the shadows darker and more oppressive than ever. Inside, we set up the ritual in the same operating room. My dad drew the symbol on the floor, his movements precise and practiced. I lit the candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. As we prepared, the whispers started again, louder and more frantic. I could feel the Watcher's presence, its malevolent gaze fixed on us. My dad began the chant, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. The symbol on the floor began to glow, and I felt the energy in the room shift. Suddenly, the Watcher appeared, its glowing eyes filled with hatred. It stepped into the room, its twisted smile sending chills down my spine. Now, my dad shouted, begin the ritual. I raised the dagger, my hands shaking. The Watcher lunged at me, but the warmth from the vial I had drunk before seemed to create a barrier, holding it at bay. I began the chant, repeating the words my dad had taught me. The symbol on the floor flared with light, and the Watcher screamed, its form distorting as it was pulled towards the symbol. But then, something went wrong. The light flickered, and the Watcher broke free, its eyes blazing with fury. It lunged at my dad, its fingers wrapping around his throat. No! I screamed, rushing forward. I plunged the dagger into the Watcher's back, the blade sinking deep into its flesh. The Watcher let out a final, agonized scream before disintegrating into a cloud of darkness. The symbol on the floor glowed brighter and then faded away, leaving only a faint outline. My dad collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. "It's done," he said, his voice weak. "The Watcher is gone." I helped him to his feet, tears streaming down my face. "Are you okay?" He nodded, his face pale but determined. "We did it. We actually did it." As we made our way out of the hospital, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The Watcher was gone, and the burden of the mark was lifted. But I knew that this was only the beginning. There were still other entities out there, other places that needed protecting, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The days following the ritual were strange. For the first time in what felt like forever, I slept soundly. The oppressive sense of being watched had lifted, and the whispers were gone. My dad and I shared a quiet breakfast the morning after, a rare moment of peace between us, but I could tell he was still deeply troubled. That afternoon, he sat me down in the living room. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "The Watcher was only one of many. Our family has a duty to protect the world from these entities. And now that you know, you're part of that duty too." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle on my shoulders. "I understand, but why now? Why tell me all this after keeping it a secret for so long?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. "Because you've proven yourself. You faced the Watcher and survived. That's something most people can't even imagine." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of pride. "So what do we do now?" "We prepare," he said. "There are other places like the hospital, other entities that need to be contained. We'll need to gather more information, find out where they are, and plan our next move." Over the next few weeks, my dad and I worked together to research the other entities. He taught me how to read the ancient texts, how to perform the rituals, and how to protect myself from the dark forces we were up against. It was a lot to take in, but I was determined to learn. One night, as we were poring over a particularly old and cryptic book, the phone rang. My dad answered, his face growing pale as he listened to the person on the other end. "We'll be there as soon as we can," he said, hanging up and turning to me. "There's been another sighting," he said, his voice tense. "An old mansion on the outskirts of town. People have reported seeing strange lights and hearing whispers. It sounds like another entity is awakening." I felt a chill run down my spine. "When do we leave?" "Now," he said, grabbing his coat. "We need to get there before it gains too much power." We packed our gear quickly and headed out into the night. The drive to the mansion was eerily quiet, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. When we arrived, the mansion loomed in front of us, its windows dark and empty. As we approached, I felt the familiar sense of dread settling over me. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear faint whispers, just on the edge of my hearing. We entered the mansion cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The inside of the mansion was a maze of rooms and hallways, each one more decayed and eerie than the last. As we made our way deeper into the building, the whispers grew louder, and I could feel the presence of the entity watching us. We finally reached a large, open room at the center of the mansion. In the middle of the room, there was a circle of candles, similar to the ones we had used in the hospital, and standing in the center of the circle was a figure, its back turned to us. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do we do?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We need to perform the ritual, just like before. But be careful. This entity might be more powerful than the Watcher." We set up our candles and began the chant, the ancient words filling the room with a strange energy. The figure in the center of the circle turned to face us, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. As the ritual continued, the entity grew more agitated, its form shifting and distorting. The whispers turned into screams, and the room grew colder, the air thick with malevolence. "Keep going!" my dad shouted over the noise. "We're almost there!" But then something went wrong. The entity broke free of the circle, its eyes blazing with fury. It lunged at my dad, its fingers wrapping around his throat. Dad! I screamed, rushing forward. I grabbed the ritual dagger and plunged it into the entity's back, just like I had with the Watcher. The entity let out a blood-curdling scream, its form disintegrating into a cloud of darkness. The candles flickered and went out, leaving us in darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding. When I finally found it and turned it on, I saw my dad lying on the floor, gasping for air. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping him to his feet. He nodded, his face pale but determined. "We did it," he said, his voice weak. "The entity is gone." As we made our way out of the mansion, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but I knew that this was only the beginning. There were still other entities out there, other places that needed protecting, and I was ready to face whatever came next. Over the next few months, my dad and I continued our work, tracking down and sealing away the dark entities that threatened our world. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I thought we might not make it, but we never gave up. We knew that we were the last line of defense against these ancient, malevolent forces. One night, as we were preparing for another mission, my dad sat me down and looked me in the eye. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You've become a true guardian, and I know that no matter what happens, you'll continue our family's legacy." I nodded, feeling a sense of pride and determination. "I won't let you down," I said. "I promise." And as we headed out into the night, ready to face whatever horrors awaited us, I knew that we were prepared. We were guardians, protectors of the world against the darkness, and no matter what came next, we would face it together.